My name is Alex Oelofse. My family and I own and operate a private game reserve in Namibia, on which we have both black and white rhino, as well as elephant, lion, hippo, and various other species. So on a day-to-day basis, we are confronted with the challenges of conservation, and right now one of the big challenges is keeping rhinos alive and protecting both rhino species, black and white. A little bit of history on rhino poaching and the demand for rhino horn. In 1977, the international trade of rhino horn was banned and made illegal. This was done by CITES. CITES is the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. In the 70s, rhino horn could be bought in the early 70s for about $1 per kilogram of horn. That was what the value was. And then with the oil boom in the Middle East, there was a huge growth in demand for rhino horn, pretty much as a status symbol. They used it a lot for making dagger handles and ornaments. And with the increase in wealth in the Middle East, this is what drove a big boom in the demand for rhino horn. And then, of course, there has been the traditional Asian market, part of which is medicinal value, which is actually a smaller amount to also just being a status symbol. Currently on the black market, rhino horn is worth about $60,000 per kilogram, and that's just for the raw horn. That is not for the worked product. So typically for the Asian market, rhino horn would be smuggled out of Africa and then to Vietnam, and then in Vietnam they would do the value adding, where they would then carve on ornamental products, make dagger handles or libation bowls, jewelry, and then the average resale value of the worked product of rhino horn is roughly about $180,000 per kilogram. So worth way much more than gold, cocaine, platinum, you name it. And that is currently what the big problem is, that there is so much money in rhino horn that it's just driving poaching further and further. And unfortunately, with the scarcer rhinos become, and the harder it is for poachers to come by horn, that just increases the value of the rhino horn on the black market. So in the last few years, we've seen price increases, and we've also seen trading of horn or investing in rhino horn as an asset. So there is actually trading of horn in the black market, just as one would trade gold. Now, when it comes to poaching and the decline of rhino, most people have only really become aware of it post 2010, when rhino poaching started to become bad in South Africa. What few people know is that pre-2010, the domestic trade of rhino horn in South Africa was actually legal. It got banned in 2010, apparently because it would give a bad image for the 2010 Soccer World Cup. And then about 4 years ago it was reopened. However, this is only domestic trade. International trade is still governed by CITES, and right now there is no legal international trade. However, there is a flourishing illegal international market in rhino horn. And even though one generally thinks it's mainly the Asian and then the Middle Eastern market, rhino horn can be found pretty much all over the world. In New York, in Little Italy, if you look hard enough, you can buy rhino horn in some of the little shops there. So it's really only hit the media and a little more the international media scene and news scene post 2010. However, if we look at stats going back, in 1950 there were 100,000 black rhino. Currently we sit with less than 5,000. So that means in the last 70 years we have lost 95,000 black rhino. And this is all been due to poaching. So one of the reasons that it started becoming bad in South Africa around 2010 is that most of the rest of Africa was poached out. There used to be 33 range states or countries which had rhino. Currently there are only 11 countries that have rhino. The white rhino numbers were very low in the 70s due to overhunting and poaching as well, and then due to conservation efforts in South Africa. The rhino numbers started growing. Namibian white rhino numbers started growing and peaked at roughly about 22,000 animals, also around 2010. In 2010, Kruger National Park had an estimated number of about 11,000 white rhino. Currently, Kruger sits with roughly 700 white rhino, all due to poaching. So white rhino numbers have drastically declined. And if we look at the statistics for not just the past 12 years, but the past 70 years, we've been losing rhino at a rate of roughly 1,000 rhino a year. And with the increase in the value of rhino horn, it seems like we are just going to keep going on this path unless something drastically changes. If we do keep going on this path, it would give us roughly another 10 to 15 years until we do not have any wild populations of rhino left. The problem at the moment is that a dead rhino is worth way much more than a live rhino. So a big rhino horn on the black market would be worth anything between 350 to 400,000 US dollars, just the raw horn unworked. In South Africa right now, one can buy a breeding cow for roughly about 150,000 rand, so say 10,000 US dollars. Which means that the dead rhino is worth 40 times the live rhino. And this is the whole problem. This is why rhino are being slaughtered. This is why Oelofse Shushului Game Reserve has lost over 120 rhino just this year. Just this year, and it's not stopping. So the question now becomes, how do we save our lost rhinos? How do we keep the species alive? Because at the current rate, we are running into a genetic bottleneck, which will give us a lot of problems breeding them back up for future generations. But firstly, we need to stop the poaching. So there are a few different thoughts on how to do this. Typically, people would say we need to do better anti-poaching work to keep rhino populations alive. But if you look at the vastness of some of the areas rhinos roam, it's near impossible task. If you look at Kruger Park, they probably have one of the best anti-poaching teams in the world. 4 full-time helicopters, dogs that jump out of helicopters, and it's full-on military operation. And yet, even with an anti-poaching team like that, they have lost roughly 10,000 rhino just due to poaching. The other train of thought is that the end user needs to be educated that rhino horn is worthless as a medicinal value, and that it is not worth the status symbol to see the species die. However, if you look at the Chinese market, you're looking at roughly 350 million people that are in the middle class that have money to spend. and to try and change somebody's train of thought. Who these people have a culture that is 3,000 years old, and they're cut off from the rest of the world. They don't see the same things we see on the internet. And to try and change all these people's way of thinking is pretty much impossible. It would also be, you could equate it to trying to tell a Christian that they are not allowed to believe in Christianity anymore. And a lot of studies have been done on the end users of the product, and the users of rhino horn as for medicinal purposes, and also as status symbols. And in most of the research done, the user doesn't know the state of poaching and what's going on with the species. And in surveys done, they would rather prefer horn coming from a live rhino and a wild rhino. And actually a premium is paid in certain parts for that. So what do we mean with horn coming from a live rhino? Well, so when you cut off a horn from a rhino, there's a way to dehorn a rhino where you can cut off the horn without going into the nerves or into the flesh. And it's pretty much exactly the same as trimming a fingernail, because rhino horn is the exact same properties of fingernails. It's keratin. So when you trim a rhino horn or cut it off, it grows back. So rhino horn grows back with roughly about 1 kilogram a year on white rhinos. So dehorning is a means to try and prevent poaching, to take away the lure of the horn from the rhino. However, because it grows back at such a rate, you need to dehorn rhinos at least every 2 years to make sure that there isn't enough rhino horn to make it lucrative for them. And still, if you dehorn a big rhino, you can't cut too low, otherwise you hit the nerves. So you still typically leave at least about 1 kilogram to 1.5 kilograms of horn on the rhino. And at that value, I mean, you're looking at least $60,000 just for that little bit of horn on the rhino. And for that amount of money, sometimes poachers will even shoot dehorned rhino and just take that little bit of horn off. So, in our opinion, the only way to stop rhino poaching is to legalize the trade of horn. Because currently there is trade in horn. It is just an illegal trade, which we have absolutely no control of. The poachers on the ground get next to nothing for shooting the rhino and actually taking the horn off. And then the smugglers and the dealers are the ones who make huge amounts of money in dealing the horn. So the idea is, if we legalize the trade of horn, and we can sell directly to the end user, and we cut out the whole illegal chain, from the smuggler and the local smuggler on the African side, to the international smuggler, to the dealer on the end user side. So now the question is, why is it illegal, or why can we not trade in horn at this present time? And this is all governed by CITES. So CITES has a few appendices on which animals are listed, and depending on how endangered an animal is, it would either be CITES Appendix 1 or CITES Appendix 2. CITES Appendix 1 animals need an export permit from the country of export, as well as an import permit from the country of import. CITES Appendix 2 animals, such as the African elephant, only need an export permit from the exporting country. And what's interesting is that, according to the CITES legislation, it is fully legal to export a live rhino, an entire live rhino, to China, but it is illegal to export a horn from Africa to China. Since 2006, roughly 120 rhinos have been exported between South Africa and Namibia to China. one doesn't really know what happens to them on that side, but it is assumed that they are bred there and dehorned. Um, some of them would be used in zoos or safari parks, but that with the amount of money in horn, it is assumed that a lot of them are bred and then dehorned there, and the horn is traded there. The sad part is that we are taking animals away from their habitat, and they are being used there and kept alive there for exactly what we say we can do here. We can keep them alive here and supply the market without taking the animals out of the habitat. And unfortunately, this just shows that CITES, even though it was founded for the right reasons and for the conservation of the species, currently it has become just a political organization, with countries who do not even have certain species are allowed to vote on matters of countries that do have a species. When we look at CITES, there are 183 signatories to CITES. However, only 11 of those countries actually have rhino. But when it comes to matters of rhino and applications to CITES to change legislation, all 183 countries can vote. And then you have a lot of influence from NGOs and green groups who are against the legalization of rhino horn and the trade in rhino horn. NGOs are typically against any sustainable use or consumptive use of any animal products, and they push very hard at CITES conferences against the trade of horn. And unfortunately, there are a lot of countries that can be bought by a lot of the dollars given to them by NGOs to vote in whichever way these NGOs think. So the question comes up, what are the chances of the trade of rhino horn becoming legal? And in my personal opinion, the only way African countries would legally start the trade of rhino horn is if they were to step out of CITES. As long as countries remain signatories of CITES, I don't see anything changing in the trade of rhino horn. There is just too much pressure from the outside, and unfortunately there are too many politicians at CITES who are uneducated and unwilling to make waves by making hard decisions. So as it stands now, I don't see any change in the legislation at CITES, and I don't see anything from CITES coming legalizing the trade of rhino horn. And unfortunately, I don't see many African countries leaving CITES, because when we look at CITES, it's a lot broader. It doesn't just concern rhino. It concerns a lot of export of other animals and trophy hunting as well. And I don't see African countries leaving CITES at a whim, and risking a lot of their other export and revenue stream when we look at trophy hunting in Africa. Which leaves the question, so what happens to the rhino? And unfortunately, if we look at statistics, and not just short-term but long-term statistics, and the decline of rhino, it doesn't show much hope. I believe that within 10 to 15 years from now, we won't see rhinos in the wild anymore. And the reason for this is international politics. Can you really blame the poacher on the ground who gets a mere 5,000 rand, or in a high instance 10,000 rand, to shoot a rhino? If you look at unemployment rate in Southern Africa, we're probably way above the 40%. Can you really blame someone who wants to make some money to feed his family? Can you really blame the end user who's cut off from the rest of the world, who's cut off from the internet, who doesn't know what's going on the ground in Africa, who has rhino horn as part of their culture for the last 3,000 years? Can you really blame them? Well, we're on the ground here every day, and we have a solution. We have a solution to stop poaching. We know how to turn it around. It's been done with ostrich. It's been done with crocodiles. When you think of ostriches, you never think that there was a time when they were almost wiped out because they were hunted for their feathers and their skin. And then legal farming of ostriches started, and now ostriches are a dime a dozen. Their worth has dropped so much that many ostrich farms have closed because it's not worth it anymore. Same thing with crocodiles. Crocodiles used to be hunted for their skin. Numbers reduced dramatically, and then legal farming of crocodiles started, and now nobody ever hears about anybody poaching a crocodile. So we have the solution. We know on the ground how to keep these animals alive and how to save the species. And yet we fight against international politics. So who is really to blame for the disappearance of the species? Well, in my personal opinion, every Western politician out there and every NGO group are responsible for the demise of the rhino. And the species at this rate will go extinct. There isn't a picture of hope of we're going to save this, we're going to win this. No, they will go extinct. The more we fight the poachers, the more we postpone the outcome, but the outcome will be the same. And unfortunately, you have politicians unwilling to take the hard decisions and the unpopular vote, and politics, international politics, and Western politicians will be the demise and the extinction of the rhino in the end. Unfortunately, this is not a message of hope, but it's a message of reality, because this is the reality we sit in. And now and then there will be a news article or something on the news, and some headline about poachers being caught, and people get the idea of, okay, maybe it's not that bad. But if you are on the ground and you see it every day, you lose hope. And currently, as it stands now, there really isn't much hope for rhino long term. So sorry for the doom and gloom message, but it is a message of reality.